The re-election of Donald Trump is reshaping global alliances, and it's forcing Germany to rethink its role on the world stage. To help us make sense of this moment, I'm joined today by Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, Senior Advisor at the Bertelsmann Foundation and an expert in the transatlantic relationship. Cathryn, thank you so much for joining us today. You are the perfect person to talk to about this because you span both cultures. You have a parent from each country. You're a citizen of both Germany and the United States. Did you ever imagine that the relationship would ever feel as fragile as it does today?
No, Kate, and it's precisely because I feel that so much of what's happening in the United States now, the degree of which it's impacting how the United States works internally, so the strength of its own democracy, its institutions, how it serves its people, and then conversely, how the United States relates to a global system for which it was the anchor for 80 years. You know, the founding power, the maintenance power. I consider so much of what is happening now profoundly un-American in the way that I was raised to understand what Americanism means, which includes responsibility for your neighbor, responsibility for those, you know, across the ocean. This idea that America had ideals and visions and was one of those powers in the world that was a self-correcting power, unlike so many of the historical powers in Europe. And so those are things that I have always associated with being American and with the American role in the world. And I find that profoundly under threat right now.
Do you feel then that there's a fundamental disconnect between the values of this administration and the people that elected it?
Well, certainly in the outcomes, because what you see, I think now, just beyond the 100-day threshold of this administration is that the values that animate the powers in the White House, and I don't just mean the president, I also mean the sort of rank of advisors that are guiding some of the sort of more intricate policies that then will have to, at least from the administration's standpoint, be cast into legislation, which is what Congress is trying to do right now, is profoundly against the interests of those who elected the president to the White House. And so a lot of what you're seeing now is that public opinion is beginning to shift quite starkly, but that part of the main goal of this administration is to change structures so that those opinions of the Americans that now will be affected by, for instance, the tariff policy, by, for instance, the recessive energies that we're already feeling in the American economy, but also things on individual rights, that they won't be able to claw that back because there are changes being made in the system that will be almost impossible to reverse, at least not in sort of one electoral term or certainly, you know, from a midterm election to a presidential election.
You mentioned that Germany or the United States has lost its position as an anchor in the world. And I'm wondering where Germany comes into this, because the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz has acknowledged that Germany has relied for too long on the United States, and he's pumping hundreds of billions of euros into defense. I'm wondering if you think that commitment will be matched by a willingness to become more interventionist in international conflicts in the way that the United States may once have.
Well, I think that's a great question, and it's a very complicated question because it's not a question that has been really mobilized in German society. There was a chance to have that conversation in an extended way right around the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. And because of how the Americans intervened again in one of the predominant conflicts of the time on the European continent, i.e. through a NATO intervention, you know, led at the time, argued for by Madeleine Albright, you know, held fast by Bill Clinton, those kind of things. The Europeans sort of fell back into this slumber of not really understanding what extended responsibility, both for their own backyard, their own security, but then also for global security would mean. I'll remind you that there was a federal president who has his office right down the street here in Berlin, Horst Köhler, who passed just a few months ago, who said, well, German security might have to be defended in the Indo-Pacific in sort of an extended way. And he was thinking about economic security primarily, given his own biography. And that was such an affront to a social conversation that he felt he needed to step down from office. And I can't say that sort of in strategic culture, the country, even though we have, you know, a historic land war now on the European and Eurasian continent, has really emerged such that there's a fundamental understanding in German society that in order to secure your way of life going forward, you might have to make more sacrifices economically. In defense terms, there is now a discussion about, the draft or a potential toward a draft or conscription, and then maybe a draft if conscription doesn't fill the ranks of the army. But that seems to be rankling a lot of feelings in German society. So there needs to be a very concerted conversation about what societal, economic, and also military resilience will mean for Germany. And the urgency of the moment has hit political Berlin, but I'm not sure it's hit the entire country.
Do you think, in a way, then, Trump has done the continent a favor by shifting public opinion a little bit more in favor of taking responsibility for the continent's own security?
Well, it's sort of unfortunate that, shock therapy is what was needed, because the integrated security threats that the European continent has faced, it's faced for a while. I mean, German businesses are losing 267 billion euros every year just based on cyber, ransomware, all series of attacks, espionage, and that has grown 30% sort of year on year. But those are threats that have sort of been in the water, that they've been coming. The Chinese have long been engaged in things like IP theft. So fundamental things that make a European and make a German economy strong, but that only now, in combination with this kinetic threat from Russia, are we waking up to, the real consequences of. And there's long been talk about, expanding European capacity for self-defense, also for deterrence. Since George W. Bush put this on the table, Obama underscored the idea that the Americans were possibly more willing to let the Europeans go their own way in charting a sort of a unified course, and yet there was little action. So it's going to feel painful, this transition. But by that same token, such are the threats that, that are now cascading around the European continent, the Eurasian continent, frankly, with this stronger relationship between Russia and China. So those are now the realities which you have to contend with. And so now you need a strategic culture on caffeine, effectively, or get that started, such that the average German, the average European understands what needs to be done to make sure that the continent stays holistically safe.
And do you feel confident that sufficient action is being taken by this new government?
Well, I think the new government is smart to look very closely to the drive that is coming out of Brussels. Europe has done, the European Union, the capital of it, has done something quite remarkable, because it used to be that it worked very, very slowly, and it has, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, found a whole set of instruments in which to bring together monies, bring together ideas, fundamentally create burden-sharing capacities within the EU. That's always been the case within NATO, at least on paper, and mostly functional. But in the EU, that's new. The idea that, we're really motivating ideas, again, that were long contested in the European context about, how we might think about joint debt burden if it serves a strategic purpose, how we think about those strategic elements. And I think the German government, that makes it easier for German government to argue vis-a-vis its own electorate that these things are necessary and that Germany is not doing it alone. Because, of course, given Germany's history, the idea of having an army, that is funded by something around 3 to 5% GDP in terms of defense spending irks people based on their perception of German history and German responsibility in the world, where their idea was that German diplomacy, German efforts toward peace should be how Germany positions itself in the world. Frankly, it's going to need both. And so I think in that case, Germany's new government is helped by the European context that's really pushing this idea of urgency, burden sharing, new instruments, and new financial resources.
Yeah, because this really is an economic question as well, isn't it? You mentioned the stagnation in Germany at the moment. The government is committing hundreds of billions of euros into kickstarting growth. I'm wondering where you feel the best possibility for a revival exists, and if you think those concerns that the country is taking too much new debt on are justified.
Well, I think the the backward question is, what has Germany not done over the last 15 to 20 years? And on a fundamental way, we're all talking about dual use technology, and that's fine. But we need other dual use elements that are sort of fundamental both to the competitiveness of the country and the well-being of its citizens. Infrastructure, bridges need to be strong and functional in order, yes, to get people from A to B, but also if you need to move military materiel to the same way. The Poles have been reinforcing their bridges now for 5 years on the basis that, there might be some sort of kinetic attack or some movements by Russia that they'll have to move military material. So investing in infrastructure, investing in Germany's failing schools, if you're going to try to get close to competing on a technological, innovative level with the large powers, the United States will remain one of them, even though you have an attack on universities now. And China, certainly, if Germany wants to keep pace, keep its image as an innovation champion, you're going to need functional schools. You're going to need functional STEM education. You're going to need investments in that realm the same way. And then, of course, you can think about investing in a predictable way in your integrated defense sector or in technologies that are indeed dual use. That's what the Pentagon has been doing for the past 25 years. So all the ways in which Germany is successful on the innovation side, in quantum, in biotechnology, in a lot of the kind of innovative research that's done, by the way, close to business. It's done less in universities and close to business. Those are the kind of things that could help propel Germany forward if the investments are smart. They're structured in context with Germany's companies, because there seems to be at least not enough exchange between Germany's economic drivers, its companies, and certainly the previous government, and then really thinking about where the pockets of innovation are. And that includes thinking smartly about industrial policy, where the state can intervene, and where the state should frankly stay out of it.
Where should it stay out?
Well, I do think that in some of the innovative policies and the cross-pollination between certain industry sectors, that should be left to industry to decide. But part of where the state should stay out is, frankly, in overregulation. And that's the whole discussion about ending a hyper-bureaucratization in Germany. It's unbelievably difficult to get anything done here, even to get internet in your own home. Takes days, often doesn't work. Those are the kind of things that, a modern economy shouldn't be wrestling with. It's unbelievably difficult in Germany right now to get from point A to point B using integrated public transportation. That is odd, particularly in some of the most populous, most industrially home to the greatest industries in Germany, in North Rhine-Westphalia. Things are constantly failing. So that needs to be rethought. That's where the state needs to lean in. But on bureaucracy, on the rulemaking, on extraneous rules that hamper certain new investments, that hamper startups, that hamper sort of mobility and agility in the business sector, the state needs to get out.
So we know about the problems. I'm interested because you recently moved from the United States to Germany. What is better here?
That is bread. That's the easy part. Look, I think a lot of ways of finding novel ways of interacting between different sectors is something that this country is only waking up to, that, the sort of government sector in Berlin cannot be solely responsible for finding answers. I think looking more to how that's been done in Anglo-American countries, frankly, I would include the UK in that idea, really putting a whole of government approach to actually solving the problem and not focusing overly on the process. That's something that the Germans really embraced after World War II, creating democratic processes with lots of breaking points, but oftentimes that creates inefficiencies in the system. But I do think that there is sort of a willingness to remember how Germany pulled itself out of its initial founding crisis. There's now sort of a different sort of memory culture emerging too, to say, look, we built this Wirtschaftswunder at the time, we can do it again. That sort of narrative and esprit needs to come back. I think you're finding it in a lot of companies. And I think if you begin to retell a German narrative, recast a German narrative, that can have a pull effect that can, bring back that innovative energy for which Germany was once known in design, in engineering, but, still manifest in its bread culture.
So bread and innovation, maybe we can combine the two. I want to talk about trade now because last year the United States overtook China as Germany's top trading partner. Given the unpredictable policy coming out of Washington right now, where do you envision Germany's economic partnerships to be directed in the next couple of years?
Well, Germany and German industry is for a lot of the ills that the Trump administration has only now created for the American economy, by the way, the solution. And if Germany thought smartly about its capacity of creating economic statecraft, so where a government strategy, a foreign policy strategy speaks closely and aligns very closely with its businesses who are in the United States. I mean, the amount of business volume, of businesses present, of businesses invested in the United States in all manner, by the way, in the asset market, but also just in terms of plants and manufacturing in the United States, where they're sharing components. That is a lot of knowledge. That's a lot of on-the-ground knowledge. And what Donald Trump's tariff policies are creating, by the way, he's changed it 50 times since he took up his mantle. I think that is a moment for particularly German enterprise to have a sort of seismographic knowledge of what's going on in places like South Carolina, where German enterprise is deeply invested. But the machine builders are all around the country. And for all the things that will be difficult for Donald Trump to, out of this situation, build the Gilded Age that he's promised American voters, right? Without access of, capable research and innovation in American universities, because there's a culture war going on against the universities. Without the benign cooperation of Mexico and Canada, because he's shut them out first with his tariff policy. Without the kind of credibility in the global economic system to push American products out such that that's a credible way of leaning into an export market. The way to solve some of Donald Trump's domestic problems are by investing greater or by leaning on German industrial manufacturing capacity in country, but also outside of the country. So I think there are opportunities there strategically applied for German businesses, not in this very moment, but in sort of the next 18 months, to begin to find opportunities to solve pain points for this president in a way that they can also negotiate value. Moral value and access and the kind of things that will force a president's line to soften or to turn around. And we've seen that happen when this president is backed into a corner. We've seen that over the last couple of weeks. He turns quite drastically, sometimes on a dime. So I see opportunities there, but German businesses are putting their investments on pause, on hold. They're very, let's say, risk conscious. And they're looking, I think, very closely at what the various closing off energies, particularly vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada, will mean for their bottom line. And so unless there's a change of tune there and the wider market is a North American market, I don't see a lot of additional investments going over right now.
Is risk consciousness the right approach for Donald Trump?
Well, it's certainly what the Europeans did smartly, and I think what other partners have done smartly, is to show a strong line. What I think a lot of the advisors around the president on the economic and tariff policy did not bargain with was the degree to which other countries would embrace retaliatory measures. First and foremost, the People's Republic of China. That's not in any of the calculations of Steve Moran, who runs the National Economic Council, that the retaliatory energies would be so high. And I think that is important for Donald Trump to understand. There's a bit of an overestimation, I think, of American capacity. I mean, you might say that's wonderfully optimistic, but then there are, of course, all the policies that kind of run against those kind of tendencies, which is the research and administration, the research and innovation capacities of American universities that are being kneecapped right, left, and center. There is all the diversity and innovation that's being kneecapped on all sorts of other ways. So I think the idea for European companies, for companies that are outside the United States, is to think about whether or not moving their plants or cementing their plants in the United States is a good idea given the changing tax situation, given the volatility of the workforce, the shifting longevity in terms of planning for skilled labor force in the United States, and whether it's not useful to continue to diversify, to look at the globe truly as it is, which is the globe, to look at other trading partners, which will soon have more stable trading environments with the European Union, including Mercosur, including the Canadians, including more maneuverability in the conversations with the Australians, including filling the FTA that the Germans have with Japan with greater life. I think all of those are possibilities. And so doing all of that math right now, playing that out in scenarios, figuring out how diversification and regionalization, right, strengthening your capacity in the European market can help buffer the bottom line. So I don't think risk analysis right now is not a bad move.
There are people that say the failure to complete TTIP has been a disaster. What is your take on that?
Well, look, TTIP, there were 2 million Germans right out here by the Brandenburg Gate, while TTIP was negotiated. TTIP, by the way, was a wonderful example of how social media can inform public opinion on complex things like trade negotiations. And the question is inform or misinform, because, of course, the greatest sticking point at the time then for the public was the idea that you'd be able to import American meats, particularly chicken washed in chlorine. That was a big no-no for all the Germans, coalescing around the Brandenburg Gate. I think what the European Union offered right away and calling Donald Trump's bluff, and I thought that was an excellent diplomatic move. I used to lead a program on diplomacy at the Harvard Kennedy School, was to say, okay, let's go to zero tariffs on goods exchange. Can be done. And the fact that that caught the American administration almost entirely off guard and exposed the fact that they didn't really have a goal for their, because the questions were always, is the tariff policy there to fill the coffers of the American Treasury and in fact, take away a need for American income tax? Or are you really trying to structure the global economy? Or are you truly ready and able to accept a more fair trade deal? And that's where the Europeans called Trump's bluff and made very clear that there's really no fully articulated, internally cohesive objective for this tariff policy, bar maybe then to cause abject chaos in the trading system and reduce global value, which is absurd, but a fact now. So I think TTIP would have been great, but nobody, hindsight's always 2020, which is to say, I think to push on sort of a zero tariff solution on goods, to negotiate an agreement on raw materials, to negotiate, as was the case in the Biden administration, something on steel and aluminum, those would all be the rational paths forward. Do we have an administration in Washington that embraces the rational path? No. So I think, what the future of a transatlantic trade deal would be is still very much in the offing.
I want to look at Europe as a bloc now, because we have enormous fractures within the European Union, particularly with countries like Hungary blocking sanctions on Russia. At the same time, it seems that the EU's relationship with the UK is becoming a little bit closer again. I'm wondering what role you see for Europe as a continent in this new world order.
Well, I think what's been made very obvious is that, again, the sort of defense access, and this goes back to Saint-Malo in the 90s, the French and the UK taking a lead on the entire sort of thinking about what European self-articulated defense capacities might look like. The French, again, over this past week, thinking about how to extend the nuclear umbrella. This fits two ambitions for the French, which is their own sense of self-worth and importance for the continent and in the continent in an embattled time for them domestically, but also the fact that the Starmer government has been able to play a much larger international hand as it wrestles with some of the existing economic problems in the UK, and then being able to combine that potentially, just in a closer economic approximation with the European Union. Union, although of course this prime minister has said, no, we're not coming back. We're right now dealing with all the similar issues that we had before, fisheries being number one. But nonetheless, there's a greater impetus to realize, look, to speak in America's first ambassador's terms, that if we don't all hang together, Benjamin Franklin, we will all hang separately. And I think there's a clear understanding, both with this UK leadership, you saw this in the joint trip to Kiev, but also in the French leadership. So in the two sort of most vital defense forces, functional defense forces on the continent, that you have to rethink partnership in a functional way. Now, one of Russia's plays, and you said Hungary, is of course to try to unravel the biggest peace project in the history of humankind from the inside. And that's most effectively done through, we talked about sabotage, ransomware, disinformation. Disinformation being a fundamental thing. We've got a Polish presidential election coming up. We've just uncovered a major plot by the Russian Federation to spread disinformation in Poland, where, you've just seen a government take over again, try to claw back changes to the legal environment that, was leading Poland down a really, truly illiberal, anti-democratic course like you have in Hungary. At the same time, you have Hungary as an imitation case for countries like Slovakia. You see this right-wing push in Romania. Those are certainly not in any way developments that are done or that are in retrograde. In fact, those are still very much there. So to continue to make a case to European voting public that truly this cohesion, hanging together, will position Europe, potentially as the last bastion of functional liberal democracy in the world that actually delivers. And this is the point about democracy. Democracy needs to be seen to be delivering the kind of economic value, the kind of physical security, but then also, all the freedoms that are inherent in the function of democracy. If democracy doesn't deliver, then Russia has a pretty easy wedge pathway to continue to try to break Europe away from itself, from its purpose. And so that's, I think, the fundamental challenge that the EU faces right now. Get those three elements right to be able to continue to tell a story to Europeans that combination of freedoms, of economic vitality, and of a security provision is really what's worth sacrificing for, because that's what that will mean.
When you look at the future of the transatlantic relationship, do you see it as embodying any kind of emotional bond anymore, or has it become purely transactional?
Well, look, I think if you ask most Americans about how they think about Europe, how they think about Germany, how they think about individual countries, the numbers are still vastly positive, right? The understanding that there is still sort of a founding immigrant story there is exceptionally strong among Americans. Most Americans, by the way, still are unbelievable supporters of Ukraine in the war of aggression that Russia has waged on Ukraine. So I think on an individual level, and even on a collective level, people are still extremely pro-European. You have a government that is not, and that is an issue. And that I think for many Europeans, and particularly for many Germans, in the first Trump administration, I likened the general sentiment that many Germans felt vis-a-vis the Americans as represented by the Trump administration as sort of a death in the family. And that's really how many Germans felt it, because so much of, the German basic law, the functionality of German federalism is based on an American system in a modern incarnation of American democracy. Now, in the German case, so many of the quote-unquote old mistakes that go back 250 years to an American Constitution were corrected, if you will. But our democracies here, and I think that's the vital point, aren't as safe as we might think. If an American democracy becomes so volatile so quickly, it's certainly a stark reminder that hand-wringing as we look to the United States and sort of an over-sentimentality probably won't serve us very well. What the example of the United States now should serve us to think about is how we reinforce our own democracies, our institutions, the kind of thing that in Germany's case we once in part got from the Americans. But then how do we reinforce, make that more secure, make it more credible, and take lessons from this particular American example that way? Does that mean that tourism is going to pick up in the opposite direction? I think for right now, that's a lost cause.
Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure, Kate.